Welcome back. We had our prayers before we started recording today, so if you're joining us from home, please pause the video, take a moment if you're willing, interested, to say a prayer before we begin. And we'll dive then back into Proverbs. And we're picking up at chapter 27. I do have a little bit of bookkeeping because last time the question was raised of what is our oldest copy of Proverbs and when was it written. So I did a little research and you're not going to be happy with it. So the absolutely oldest bit of Proverbs that we know to exist is one of the Qumran pieces, but it's not a full copy of Proverbs. It's just a scrap. It's called 6Q30 or 6QPAPPROV, and it's written in Hebrew. So it's the oldest extant piece of Proverbs. As far as the whole copy of Proverbs, that would be either the copy that's in the Roman script or the Septuagint. And those would date roughly back to about the 3rd century BCE.
Ooh,
So,
that's a long after you would have expected it, right?
well, I don't know that those are actually extant. I don't know that those are full extant copies.
When was the first one you said, the piece of it, where?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's that dated to?
That one's dated to the 1st century BCE, and the Septuagint and the Roman script. Sorry, correction. Rewind. Let me say that over again. The Qumran script is 3rd century BCE to 1st century CE. The Septuagint is also sometime 3rd century BCE or after. So those two are the same. The Roman script one is not until at least 63 BCE, and maybe as late as 500 CE. There we go.
So, Jesus' study of the Old Testament would have included some of Proverbs, I assume, but it would have been really a new piece of literature.
No.
If there was any new pieces of literature.
No. That's the oldest extant copy. Copies of it existed hundreds of years before that. They just don't exist anymore. They've turned to dust.
And the oral tradition of it probably goes back
Right. Yeah.
millennia.
A lot of based on the descriptions of the sources, coming from the kings, certain wise people,
Yeah.
Solomon, and all that, we would probably estimate that it goes back to about 1000 BCE, give or take a little, as far as the oral tradition goes. Some of it might go back even further than that, but it's hard to know. But yeah, it's likely that we don't get it written down as a single book or a single scroll in that case until the exile. There may have been some of this written down prior.
And it was probably the person putting it together's discretion as to what was included and what was not.
Well, we don't really know. It's speculation.
I mean, it seems to follow, what we're reading seems to follow a pattern and a timeline, sort of.
Roughly, yeah. Yeah, the tricky part is figuring out when the oral traditions begin and what was the process of preserving the information, because the idea of literary criticism, of asking questions like, why did they write down what they wrote down, doesn't really become a thing that gets documented until the Renaissance. It takes the destruction of thousands of books before people say, maybe we should write down why we're writing things down. So So yeah, what their motivation was and exactly who was involved in structuring that is not well documented. So it's always some level of speculation. A lot of times the evidence is the books of the Bible reference these historical activities or events, or they get certain things from history right, but they get other things wrong, which suggests that they were living closer to in time to the things they get right, and further in time away from the things they get wrong. So a lot of that is used to assess when a book of the Bible is actually put to paper. So the oral tradition probably existed before that, but yeah. Anyway, other thoughts, questions on that point before we dive in?
No.
But yeah, so the long and the short of it is the Greek and the Hebrew goes back about the same time period as far as still existent copies go. But we don't know what was written prior to that, and we have every reason to believe that it was Hebrew before that. So, okay, would anyone like to read chapter 27 for us?
I will.
Go for it.
Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Let another praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. A stone is heavy, and sand is weighty, but a fool's provocation is heavier than both. Wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. He who is sated loathes honey, but to one who is hungry, everything bitter is sweet. Like a bird that strays from its nest is a man who strays from his home. Oil and perfume make the heart glad, but the soul is torn by trouble. Your friend and your father's friend do not forsake, and do not go to your brother's house in the day of your calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. Be wise, my son, and make my heart glad, that I may answer him who reproaches me. A prudent man sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. Take a man's garment when he has given surety for a stranger, and hold him in pledge when he gives surety for foreigners. He who blesses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, will be counted as cursing. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a contemptuous woman are alike. To restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in his right hand. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. He who tends a fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who guards his master will be honored. As in water, face answers to face, so the mind of a man reflects a man. Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied, and never satisfied are the eyes of man. A crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and a man is judged by his praise. Crush a fool in a mortar with a pestle, along with crushed grain, yet his folly will not depart from him. Know well the condition of your flocks, and give attention to your herds. For riches do not last forever, and does a crown endure to all generations? When the grass is gone, and the new growth appears, and the herbage of the mountains is gathered, the lambs will provide your clothing, and the goats the price of the field. There will be enough goat's milk for your food, for the food of your household, and maintenance for your maidens.
Thank you. All right. What jumped out?
crack at women, but
Yeah. Yep, we get that. Well, not all women, just contentious wives.
There's more negative, or there's more commentary about negative personality and negative acts than the previous chapters. That's my impression at first.
Yeah,
Probably not true, but I see a lot of negativity in here.
more than some of our recent chapters, but if you go back to the very beginning, there was a lot of stuff about the behavior of fools.
I love this one. He who blesses his neighbor with a loud voice early in the morning will be counted as cursing. I have a good friend who I spend a fair amount of time with. I mean, I see him about once a week and stuff. And he, in his whole lifetime, I don't think has ever gotten out of bed before 9 o'clock. And I've called him a couple times in the morning, and he just gets so mad.
Yep, some people are not early risers, that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. How true that is.
Yeah, there's something about proximity. It's interesting because so in our New Testament we get a lot of Jesus talking about family in fairly negative ways that in our culture rarely associates Christianity as being anti-family, and yet Jesus is really anti-family.
Oh
in
yeah.
shocking ways.
I first came to that realization in college, and I thought, oh my God, because I grew up in a family that, and I guess I've carried that tradition forward. Family was almost beyond anything else as far as importance is concerned.
Religion always has that sort of struggle between what is the truth of the religion and the teachings of the cultural religion. We get caught up in that same dilemma. And that's not to say that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's a complicated tension. And here the proverb kind of points to that idea of sometimes your community is more important than blood relations, right? And that's why I bring up the Jesus being anti-family.
Jesus says that more than once, doesn't he?
Oh yeah, several times. Right, and so some of that points to the idea of community. What matters is who's present, right? Like who's in the vicinity, who's in the area, who's present. Sometimes it also matters who is involved in what is being done, right? So for Jesus, he's in the middle of creating a movement. Whether he's intending this to be a movement or not is debatable, but Jesus is in the middle of something, and so he counts those who are participating in that thing as family. But this dilemma is forever with us of culture versus faith, and often those get mixed up. And so the family emphasis we often hear in Christianity really is a cultural development that human societies have a tendency to put family over community, or family over neighbor, or family over stranger, foreigner, whatnot.
Well, and there's, on a broad sense, that is an ongoing, continual thing in our society and actually the worldwide society.
It's predominantly a Western attitude. Many Eastern cultures have less of a family focus and more of a focus on either tribe or society. It's hard to assess Native American culture pre-European colonialism, but there are some cultures within Native American society that probably also held a similar attitude similar to the Eastern globe.
Well, you know, Rachel works with the Navajo and the what's the other? No, what's the other southwestern tribes?
Sioux?
Hmm?
Sioux? Lakota?
No, there's more north. No, the Navajo, the Apache, and there's a third one. Anyway, part of her studies has been the cultural, you know, where their culture's coming from and stuff. And basically, from her understanding and from what she shared with me, if you go back hundreds of years before the white man showed up, their family was community.
Right.
I mean, there wasn't mother and father. There was the tribe.
Yep.
And the offspring of a female could very well have 3 or 4 different fathers. And that's the way they raised their children, was in the community. And I think that's primarily Navajo.
Yeah, that sounds right. We get similar things in parts of Africa and in a lot of Eastern cultures. We also get historical cultures in the Eastern world that sort of lift up a society before the individual's family. And some of that is still even present today. I forget what the company was, but there was a CEO in Japan who recently got fired for making the company too profitable. That company was making too much money, and the guy who was the CEO was making too much money because he was just too successful, and the impact to the country was considered a negative. So, I mean, compare that to our American culture. We would never fire somebody for being too successful.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so yeah, it's not always easy to find the line between what our faith and our religion teaches us versus what our culture teaches us. And a lot of times those get conflated, and even our culture can supersede our faith, and yet we'll still apply the label of faith to those beliefs. It's a tricky subject.
Well, culture and faith are always intermingled.
Right. But that's if what we believe in is true, that there is a being who created all it is, a power in the heavens, whatnot, that's separate from culture. Our culture may be a reflection of what we think of God, but God's truth and teachings are separate from our culture.
My dilemma has, throughout my life, been distinguishing between what is culturally determined as right and what my faith or the teachings of Jesus says is right. And that's a distinct dilemma, because they're not the same.
No, they're very much not. And that gets really tricky.
It does.
Yeah. And the other hard part of that is we often hear people teach cultural values as if they are the teaching of Jesus.
I should know this, but who are Sheol and Abaddon? Is that places, or is that people, or?
I actually need to look into more understanding Abaddon, because Abaddon is um, generally treated as an entity, sort of a darker side of death. But that's largely because of the book of Revelation.
And what's Sheol?
Sheol is the place of the dead. So in Israelite culture, it was believed that everybody goes to the same place when they die, which is basically underground, because you're getting buried in a tomb.
So
and everybody goes there.
So the author is comparing man and the cravings of man to Sheol and Abaddon?
Yep.
Fascinating.
Yeah, let me see what our commentary says. It says go back to 112. So I gotta jump around a little here. And then I'll see if Michael Fox has anything to say about that. Yeah. So the note I have here is Sheol, the pit, the place of the dead. In Canaanite myth, which we have good reason to believe a lot of Israelite religion stems from Canaanite religion, death was depicted as having a gaping maw with which to swallow victims. So, it's sort of like our expression. There's two things unavoidable in life: death and taxes, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of pointing to this idea that Sheol and Abaddon are inescapable, right? Everyone goes to death, and so here, Sheol and Abaddon's appetites are such that they consume everything, right? It's entropic philosophy. um, and yeah, so the human vision is the eyes of man are similar. Now that one's interesting because the NRSV, which I think three of us have, translates that as as human eyes are never satisfied, right? What did you read for that? Verse 20?
And never satisfied are the eyes of man.
Yeah. So that might be a reference to lust or greed.
A reference to what?
Lust or greed. The eyes of man.
Oh.
That's why, and that's where I want to look and see what
So what did you say again?
human eyes.
Human eyes, okay.
Yeah, so one of the things that NRSV tries to remove is some of the gender language
Okay.
when it seems like the text is referring to all of humanity. So if it's greed, then human eyes make sense. But if it's an issue of something like lust, then it's likely they actually meant men in contrast to women. Verse 20. Oh, that's interesting. 27:20, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's possible that these passages get named differently in different versions. Okay. Yeah, because in the Greek, an abomination to the Lord is he who stares, who fixes the eye, and is uninstructed, and the uninstructed are temperate of tongue. See, that's significantly different. So that's interesting. But yeah. Huh.
So what is it, the next verse, the crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold? Does that mean you're not supposed to have gold?
I, no, I don't think so. The
Yeah, it's just like this.
I think it's more about the right tool for testing. So if you wanna test the purity of gold, you melt it down in the furnace. If you wanna test the purity of silver, at least in this time period, you grind it in a crucible.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that would suggest their refining processes for silver and gold were different. And the idea here, in the second part of that verse, so a person is tested by being praised. Oh yeah, so and in fact the word tested isn't in there in the Hebrew. It just says so is a person by being praised.
And then it says man is judged by his praise. So my footnote says tested by praise.
Yeah, and let me see if yeah, so in the Greek this is translated, or this can be translated as burning is a test for silver and gold, but a man is tested by the mouth of those who praise him. So there's some interpretation in here based on the on what the crucible and the furnace were used for in precious metals. Is that was how you tested materials. Because like I said, it's not, the word tested doesn't appear in the Hebrew, so it's assumed that that's what's happening. And even back at the time when they wrote the Septuagint, there's an assumption being made that this is about testing.
You know, whoever's writing Proverbs really, really despises someone considered a fool.
Yes.
I mean, it's at least 3 or 4 times each chapter he talks about fools.
Fools and bad wives.
Yep. Yeah, well, yeah, women in general are dangerous. It's it's I mean that's what
Or as it states here, like a slow rain.
Yeah.
a continual dripping on a rainy day. Yep. So some translations, like the NRSV, that try to make it more gender neutral, the idea that Proverbs is for all people. There's room to debate whether or not it's really written as a general piece of advice versus where we read my child and your version says my son. It does seem to be written for male children specifically in many places. We might find if we had a counterpart written by a mother for a daughter, we might find the opposite true, right? And so there's this again goes back to culture and interpretation. Is if we read Proverbs as being gender neutral, right, then there's a lot of negativity towards women and wives. On the other hand, if we read it as a father's advice to a son, then we might see that the language about women and wives is, so son, you're a guy. You don't know what women are like or what they're thinking. Let's talk about that, right? And we would expect, though we don't usually get the opposite perspective because we don't have very many writings of women preserved from these time periods. We might expect that likely there were probably proverbs, wives' tales, like we sometimes call them, that were handed down from mothers to daughters as well. They just didn't make it into the Bible, and they probably included things about men, right? I just saw a science fiction movie last night, 2149. It was on Amazon Prime, and it was like post-global war. every person lives inside of a pod that basically provides for their needs, and they don't go outside because the air's not safe and whatever. And and the premise is basically like lightning strikes this kid's pod when he's like 16 or something, and it breaks down, so he has to leave and go out into the dangerous world. And he meets a group of women who have all these sayings about men, like men always leave, and you start to piece together as you watch this story develop of where these sayings come from and how they come to these collection of stories. And in a lot of ways, it's almost like a women's version of Proverbs. I found that kind of interesting. But yeah, there's
2149.
there's like 2149 colon something.
Is it a recent movie?
I think so. Yeah, 2019, 2020.
Is it based on a book?
I don't know. It was really short. I would not call it a great movie, but you know, if you got 70 some minutes, it was one of those kind of like quick thrown together movies. It wasn't bad. It was
Most of those movies
gets you thinking.
have a very that look on. There's several movies or books about post-world destruction life, and they're all really negative on the human nature.
Collective human nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of them
There
are,
are good individuals in them, but collectively, yes.
which one could argue is generally true.
I don't know.
It's often a struggle to convince collective humanity to move towards what is better. So a good example would be racism. And I think if you surveyed people worldwide, you would probably find that about 99% of them agree that racism is really bad and we should do away with it. And yet, we have a lot of ambiguity around addressing racism. We're not really willing to totally stomp it out completely, because we have to leave room for the possibility that somebody who was doing a racist thing didn't mean to be racist while they were doing it, for example. So yeah, it's a struggle. I think we struggle to do good collectively.
Well, you know, it's an interesting phenomenon, and I hate to admit this, but this show that came out 4 or 5 years ago, Yellowstone.
I don't know that one.
Oh my God, it is one of the nastiest depictions of human beings there could possibly be. It's based on a modern day Montana ranch.
Okay.
And one of my friends got interested in it, and he mentioned it to me, and I watched a couple episodes of it. It is unbelievably evil, and yet it is the most watched cable miniseries
Okay.
in the last 3 years.
Even more than Squid Games?
Even more. It
Which,
is.
by the way, is another example of really horrible human behavior.
This is worse. This
You've
is
seen Squid Games?
very much worse.
Interesting.
But it's, I mean, it's just a massive hit. So, interesting.
Which,
I've said to Barb, because I've watched it like 3 or 4 times, different shows. I said, I'm ashamed of myself for watching it, but oh my God, it is so evil that what's drawing people? I guess it's the evil. So anyway,
well, and that reflects on the sort of the conversation about, are we collectively good, or do we have to struggle to achieve good collectively.
Every individual in this show is evil.
Right.
I mean, it's a collective or not. It's
But the question is, why do people enjoy watching that? And perhaps, I'm just going to throw this out there, perhaps there's something in the psychology of seeing something presented very clearly as wrong in a television program or a movie allows us to feel a little more comfortable with the reality that those things happen in our world. Because at least somebody is calling it out. Which points to the idea that we all know that there are things that are wrong in our society, and yet our level of fight to fix them only goes so far. Right? So,
what does 5 mean?
verse 5.
Better is open rebuke than hidden love.
That's interesting.
I cannot understand that.
Well, so looking at Proverbs as a whole, we get passages similar to this often. So, for example, there's one we read a couple chapters ago that was something like, "Better is the criticism of a friend than the kiss of an enemy." Right? We get, and that actually we were looking at that with the another one of the passages in here that talked about the crucible, the test for silver and gold. Gold and silver are tested in certain ways, and so is a person tested by being praised, right? The thing that Proverbs seems to like to push at frequently is the idea that having somebody criticize, rebuke, challenge you is a positive thing, right?
It is.
Our culture often says it's not. We see negativity as just wholeheartedly bad.
No, it's
Cultural.
not negativity.
Right.
A rebuke or a criticism doesn't have to be negative.
It doesn't, but we often perceive it that way in our culture. And the culture of Proverbs would seem to say otherwise, would dispute that, would say that challenges thrown against us are good things.
So is this implying that hidden love is okay but open rebuke is worse? I don't understand.
It's saying open rebuke is a good thing, I think. And then hidden love, the question is, what does hidden love accomplish? What does it do? So there's an idea of what's, we tend to look at our scripture and our religion as something very spiritual and not very practical or applicable. And in contrast, if you read the Bible from beginning to end carefully, you'll find that it is actually very practical and not all that spiritual. I mean, a lot of the Old Testament is, hey, you're in the middle of a war, you need to defeat your enemies.
Well, the whole Old
Proverbs
Testament's that way.
Right. Well, no, about a third of it. There's a lot to our scripture that has a very practical application. We might not agree with it, but it often has very practical, this is the way things should be done, or this is how you deal with this scenario kind of thing. And so this idea of the practical application of rebuke is as being valid and good, in contrast to hidden love, what does hidden love accomplish, right? In our culture, we tend to lift up love as such a strong virtue that loving somebody, even if nothing comes of it, even if you don't ever tell them, even if they don't know that they're being cared for or helped along or whatever, it's wonderful and good and great. And this culture is saying that there's nothing practical in that. And therefore, open rebuke is better than hidden love. I mean, okay. We ever since the Renaissance, we are in love with love.
Huh?
The Western world. So, and marriage is a really good cultural and societal aspect to see where this starts to happen. Renaissance era writing starts to develop the romance novel. The first real romance novels in the world come out of the Renaissance. And marriage prior to the Renaissance is largely contract, obligation. It's about merging families and merging nations and healing wounds between families that are in conflicts over land or water resources. It's not the romantic rom-coms that we see today. It's not you didn't marry for the love before the Renaissance, right? They had prostitutes for that. I mean, for the wealthy, that was literally true. Your wife was someone who was there for contractual reasons, and a lot of wealthy people had women of the night whom they actually loved. Like, they actually had romantic love for. Anyway, our culture shifts in the Renaissance, and it's largely driven by the romance novel that starts to create this perception that you can actually love and have an emotional connection with the person to whom you're married. And now in our modern era, we only marry for love, for the most part. And we often look down on anybody who marries for reasons other than love. But that's a fairly modern development. So after the Renaissance, we become in love with love. Okay, what are we doing for time? Maybe squeeze in one more, because it's at least short. Can I get a volunteer for 28?
I'll do it. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. When a land rebels, it has many rulers, but with an intelligent ruler there is lasting order. A ruler who oppresses the poor is a beating rain that leaves no food. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law struggle against them. The evil do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely. Better to be poor and walk in integrity than to be crooked in one's ways, even though rich. Those who keep the law are wise children, but companions of gluttons shame their parents. One who augments wealth by exorbitant interest gathers it for another who is kind to the poor. When one will not listen to the law, even one's prayers are an abomination. Those who mislead the upright into evil ways will fall into pits of their own making, but the blameless will have a goodly inheritance. The rich is wise in self-esteem, but an intelligent poor person sees through the pose. When the righteous triumph, there is great glory. But when the wicked prevail, people go into hiding. No one who conceals transgressions will prosper, but one who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Happy is the one who is never without fear, but one who is hard-hearted will fall into calamity. Like a roaring lion or a charging bear is a wicked ruler over a poor people. A ruler who lacks understanding is a cruel oppressor. But one who hates unjust gain will enjoy a long life. If someone is burdened with the blood of another, let that killer be a fugitive until death. Let no one offer assistance. One who walks in integrity will be safe, but whoever follows crooked ways will fall into the pit. Anyone who tills the land will have plenty of bread, but one who follows worthless pursuits will have plenty of poverty. The faithful will abound with blessings. The one who is in a hurry to be rich will not go unpunished. To show partiality is not good, yet for a piece of bread a person may do wrong. The miser is in a hurry to get rich and does not know that loss is sure to come. Whoever rebukes a person will afterward find more favor than one who flatters with the tongue. Anyone who robs father or mother and says that is no crime is a partner to a thug. The greedy person stirs up strife, but whoever trusts in the Lord will be enriched. Those who trust in their own wits are fools, but those who walk in wisdom come through safely. Whoever gives to the poor will lack nothing, but one who turns a blind eye will get many a curse. When the wicked prevail, people go into hiding, but when they perish, the righteous increase.
Thank you. Sorry, I was stifling a sneeze there at the very end. Yeah, we probably one of the strongest themes for a single chapter we've had in the whole book. We start with rulers, and then we spend probably 3/4 of this chapter on issues of wealth and the wealthy, right? So it's pretty clearly an address of primarily one category, one topic. As you were reading, I couldn't help but think, boy, this would be a nice thing to read at the inauguration every 4 years.
What did you just say about it?
This might be a good chapter to read at an inauguration. Things like, a ruler who oppresses the poor is a beating rain that leaves no food. Better to be poor and walk in integrity than to be crooked in one's ways, even though rich.
Yeah, basically it's a chapter devoted to the chastisement of the deceitful, the wealthy, and
And the powerful.
yeah.
Or another way to look at it is, it's wisdom about how to use power. Whether power is leadership, money, or faith. Because, I mean, it doesn't say rulers are inherently bad. It says rulers who oppress the poor. Yeah. And if you have wealth, yeah, verse 8 confuses me. That's one. I want to see if there's a translation issue there. Because it seems to lift up exorbitant interest rates, which is not consistent. Yeah, I'm not sure. One who augments wealth by exorbitant interest. What's yours say, Cassandra?
It says in the wrong spot. He who augments his wealth by interest and increase gathers it for him who is kind to the poor.
What did you read, Lester?
8.
One who augments wealth by exorbitant interest gathers it for another who is kind to the poor.
So Cassandra and mine eliminated exorbitant.
Yeah.
The mine said increase. By interest and increase. So does that mean he's giving his wealth to the poor?
It seems to suggest that those. So I think this one requires a little reading into it. Because on the surface it sounds like, hey, if you charge people too much interest, and in this culture charging people any interest is too much interest. But if you charge people too much interest, the interest that you gather will be used by another to benefit the poor. And I don't think that's what it's saying. I think what this proverb is suggesting is that a person who gathers too much interest, in other words, makes themselves wealthy by overcharging people who are in debt, essentially causes those who are kind to the poor to have more people to give to. In other words, it causes poverty. I think that's the implication of this passage. but the word structure is awkward. Especially given that it's in the context of criticizing the use of wealth. Because this would seem to, if you read it at just a surface level, it seems to be the opposite of what's around it. So verse 17, I did want to lift that one up a little bit. If someone is burdened with the blood of another, let that killer be a fugitive until death. Let no one offer assistance. This would be contrary to the culture in which it's written. There are in Israel there were safe cities, and if you were if you were accused of murder, you could flee to a safe city and you could not be tried there. Yeah, I think part of the idea behind the rule is that legal justice in the time period tended to be problematic for anyone accused of something. Like our culture is, I mean, U.S. culture is innocent until proven guilty, but most of the world for most of history has been guilty once accused. So there's the idea of having safe cities where when you're accused of something you can go and escape the legal ramifications is a sort of grace in those cultures. Similar, go ahead.
Well, the concept of grace kind of, which you don't really see much in the Old Testament, kind of is implied in 13.
No one who conceals transgressions will prosper, but one who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Yeah. Yeah, Jesus' emphasis on grace, and Paul even more so, don't come out of nowhere. They're there within the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It's just we tend to miss them. They're usually found in the prophets, sometimes in the Psalms and Proverbs, and sometimes in the stories where you it doesn't say it in theological language, you have to read it out of a story. So, yeah. On a similar point, verse 4, those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law struggle against them. That's a passage that doesn't work well in most modern cultures because our laws are constantly changing and human beings are writing laws. Whereas in the culture in which this is written, the law generally refers to God's law.
Ten Commandments?
No, probably more than that. Less than the 613 mikvot of the modern Jewish religion culture, but more than the Ten Commandments. But the point, the distinction here is that if we read this as civil law, we have a civil law that is often changing and often influenced by corrupt individuals, either lobbyists or corporations that write laws for politicians to put forward, or any of a number of ways in which our civil laws are structured that are not always just or right, as compared to a culture that had more or less the same law for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Granted, there'd be local edicts of rulers and mayors and governors as well, but
What is the Hebrew word for justice? And what are the various interpretations of it?
Mitzvah, I believe.
I find this interesting. Evil men do not understand justice. Well, what is justice?
Yeah, so.
I mean, that's a word that's thrown around
Sure.
pretty loosely these days.
So, let me pull this up the fastest way that I know how. Yeah, it's full. So yeah, justice is decision, ordinance, rights, privileges, customs. The hard part is how do you put something like a concept of justice into concrete language? Which verse are we looking at?
Five?
5, yeah. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely. I mean, justice to me means consequences of actions.
Okay, that's one way to.
So what is their interpretation of it?
In this passage, it's hard to say exactly what the author is going for because there's no context to tell us what kind of justice is being discussed. So as far as the Hebrew for justice, the context would heavily influence it. So,
No, an eye for an eye?
well, no, not generally. So justice can sometimes in Scripture be proper punishment for poor behavior, but justice is also used as the setting right of things that are wrong, which doesn't necessarily involve punishment.
And I would guess if you look in Webster's, it would give you kind of those interpretations.
Yeah.
But that's why I asked you, what's the Hebrew word?
Yeah. So
Imply.
So
Or how many different Hebrew words are there for justice?
to the best of my knowledge, it's largely just the one, and it's the problem is that it means a lot of things in terms
It's a nebulous term, actually.
it much like it is to us today. A lot of the terms that the tricky part is justice itself probably has just the one term in Hebrew, but there are a lot of words that sort of hover around the concept of justice, like righteousness. Like in our culture, righteousness tends to have a negative concept. We associate it with self-righteousness, right? But in the Bible, when the Bible talks about righteousness, which we misinterpret as I'm in the right, is not righteousness in that sense, but rather the best way to describe it is if you've ever worked with a document on a computer, like a Word document. Now, we lost the terms for these a long time ago, but they used to be in there. You can justify the text. Right justify, left justify, center justify.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get words like righteousness and justice in Scripture, a lot of times the theological language is not about it's not about punishment or necessarily fixing problems as much as it is putting things in the proper order, aligning things correctly. And so in a theological sense, justice and righteousness is about being in alignment with God, right? So or think of your tires as being in alignment. Your car moves forward correctly when your tires are in alignment. The world moves correctly when society is in alignment with God.
That works very good for this verse, because
Right, there's a
evil men, let's say evilness,
Mhm.
does not understand what is right for society. Whereas those who seek the Lord understand what's justice for society.
And that might be what the author is pointing towards, is I mean, we still debate what is justice in our culture. And I'm sure it was happening then too. And so for the implication is that proper alignment with God is how you make justice, how you pursue justice. Yeah. And that's always the struggle, especially as we move into secular cultures where we take God out of the equation. Now what is justice? It becomes very ambiguous. Of course, the problem with a theological society is what is aligned with God. If the people who get to say so are corrupt, then it's not justice anymore, right? So that's always the dilemma. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So, all right. There's my mouse. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? All right. We're going to close with the Lord's Prayer, and we'll wrap up here, and we'll pick up with verse 29. And next time, I think we're going to try to push through and get in all three of the last chapters. If not, that's okay. We'll do what we can. So, let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.